So I was thinking about how did the COVID-19 pandemic begin? Well, it's different for everybody. And I live in Washington State, and Washington State had the first confirmed case of COVID-19 in the United States of America. So it's been interesting. I've been writing and publishing about swimming and the kind of general trend of in watching and kind of following swimming through the kind of onset of the COVID-19 pandemic was most people were hit in March. Some people were hit in February or aware of the pandemic, but it kind of lagged behind Washington State because there's not a lot of quote-unquote high-profile swimmers that reside in Washington State. And so it was a community that kind of, from my perspective, lagged. And so I was like, well, let me think of a COVID-19 pandemic chronology reflection for the day January 21, 2020. So the 21st of January 2020, what happened that day? What documentation did I keep? And where does it fit in the COVID-19 pandemic chronology for me in my life? So on the January 21st, 2020, I got this email from the Seattle Times. Was getting email alerts from them at this point in time. It was breaking news. Case of Wuhan coronavirus detected in Washington State, first in U.S., where U.S. stands for United States of America. So, Washington State, as a resident of Washington State, and was resident here when COVID-19 first broke out in the United States of America, we were the very first. And this was not, so I received this email, so date and time, January 21st, 2020 at 11:15 a.m. So, it was not the first email that I had received about this coronavirus. It was not the first thing we'd heard on the news about this coronavirus. There were people from Washington State that were in the area, so the news kind of knew, okay, this virus might be coming towards us, like on the front end of this. It was the first place in the United States of America to get this virus, confirmed case. And so it was an interesting thing because we saw it, and like this email came in mid-morning, a little closer to noon, and I just remember being like, Dad. So Dad has a subscription to the Seattle Times, and I was like, did you see the email? Did you see we got a case? And I was like, yeah. But we were like, okay. And then it kind of like just kind of grew from there. There were more cases. Eventually it spread to the rest of the United States. It was really slow at first. It was kind of interesting to watch because I was following the news in Washington State and following swimming news, and we're getting hit in January 21, and it's nowhere in swimming yet. There are no, and so it's just kind of like, is this only going to hit us? Is it going to be a pandemic? Right? Because when it first came out, it was not a pandemic. It has to reach a certain scale before it's a pandemic. So January 21 was not yet pandemic. And 2020. And so we were just kind of watching, and we're like, okay, well, what might happen? Well, it depends on the virus, really. Is it going to shut stuff down? Is it going to shut stuff down? But in order to shut stuff down, there needs to be enough cases, and or the virus needs to be bad enough to warrant shutting stuff down. And so we just kind of watched, and I would say by February there was a bunch more cases. We had the biggest breakout. The president and vice president even came to Washington State, if I'm recalling correctly, because we were hit first in the United States of America, the state of Washington. Not Washington, D.C., Washington State. And so it was just an interesting thing to kind of see what we had gone through. Like, California is a place that got kind of hit it's the most populous state, so it gets a lot of attention, even though it wasn't the first hit. And they were kind of more hysterical in their response than Washington State. Washington State was more like, okay, so it's just like a flu, right? Okay, and going back through and reading the communications at the very beginning of the pandemic from the Seattle Times, they were just like, the flu is worse, okay, don't forget your flu shot, and stuff like that. And it was perfectly coincident in some of my news briefs from the Seattle Times. It will be, how to put it? There was a study on a vaccine for HIV, and it failed. It had negative results. Like, the vaccine was not effective for HIV. And meanwhile, coronavirus isn't, coming out at the same time. And so it was just kind of interesting going back, because I was like, from the news eyes, they have a staple medical storyline about vaccines. And I was just like, they literally just transitioned from HIV to the new coronavirus. And like, there's zero disruption in terms of like, just keep writing and publishing about vaccines. Oh, we have a new virus. Perfect. Don't forget your flu shot. And so it was just kind of interesting, because in terms of news coverage, there was a perfect segue from this thing that didn't work and they had expected to work. And so they had a bunch of, like, from a monetary perspective, they were already going to write about a successful HIV vaccine. So writing about, in the virus, HIV, so they literally, it was like perfect for them. There was like, they get to write about something that might require a vaccine. And they quickly escalated to, it might be a pandemic and stuff like that. And so it was just kind of like, from their perspective, that must have been kind of great in some ways, the Seattle Times. But we didn't, it was like, we got hit first, and it was slower moving because everybody was kind of like, well, we need a certain number of cases to shut down. Versus there were places that got hit after Washington State got their first confirmed case or cases, like a month or two after the United States, or after the United States, after Washington State, and then shut down before we shut down. So it was just a really peculiar thing to watch play out, because like, we were hit first, but then it was like slow and then shut down and like that kind of thing. And I don't know if it was at a state level that states shut down before us, but there were like, yeah, it was just kind of interesting. And some places held out, but I was just, the first case in the United States of America was here in Washington State, and the news brief dated from the Seattle Times, January 21, 2020 at 11:15 a.m. And I did check my email that day and got it within like 15 minutes of it being released. It was cool to actually be there and get the news when it broke, or within like a very reasonable time frame. To actually get the breaking news when it was breaking news. It was very cool. And to be living here.